Hello again, round three, third time's a charm. I'll continue with questions from King Lear. Number four, characterize the women in King Lear. Do you see the sisters falling into the model of an archetypal Mary figure, the virgin saint mother, the innocent paragon of virtue, the nurturer and defender of purity? Or would an Eve archetype be more fitting, the evil seductress, the conniving bitch, the manipulator, the reason for man's fall into temptation and animal desire? Or do the characterizations transgress those regressive stereotypes and become something else that is much more complex and no longer defined by simple good-bad binary descriptions of intent and behavior? The women in Shakespeare's plays, I find it to be always a very, very fascinating topic. Curiously enough, there's no mother figure in the play, right? There's no mother for Cordelia and the two sisters, and there's no mother for Gloucester's sons. We do hear of the woman that he had the affair with, and the woman that he had, the illegitimate child by. And you probably noticed if you watched the discussion that Ian McKellen made in talking about the character of Lear, one of the links I gave you last week, where he made, I thought it was a beautiful backstory that he imagines that Lear actually has been twice married, that he was married to a woman who gave him the two elder daughters, Goneril and Regan, and then for whatever reason he married someone else. Perhaps he was widowed, and then the woman who gave him Cordelia, who was probably the one that he genuinely loved, both the mother and the daughter, who probably died in childbirth. And McKellen was talking about having two wedding rings on his finger when he played the role. And I found that to be sort of a very interesting way of seeing the character, because it's not clear in the text, except that the personalities of the two older sisters are so fundamentally different from the younger sister that maybe there is something there. So anyways, we always have this issue of the missing mother figures, and you see that very, very frequently in these plays. But then if we look at the three sisters, who are basically I believe that's the totality of the other female characters in the play, obviously Goneril and Regan are quite conniving. They will play on men like monsters of the deep. They're frequently associated with these vicious animal-like images, and certainly we wouldn't call them saintly and virginal by any stretch of the imagination. They're both kind of conniving. They're actually both ready to jump into an adulterous relationship with Edmund, even while at times their husbands, Albany is certainly still alive, and they're sort of fighting over who's going to be able to run off with the illegitimate son of Gloucester, and so they're clearly presented to us in a quite negative way. Probably the more complicated question here would be Cordelia. How do you see her? Is she purely positive? Because there might be reason to believe that what Lear is asking of her is not that much, and that maybe she is a little bit headstrong, a little bit strong-willed, and a bit, one of the other things McKellen said is that he finds Lear to be, very stubborn, pig-headed kind of man. And in fact, you could argue that Cordelia might take after her father in that respect. And so she might not necessarily be a purely, as I said, a Mary-like figure of purity and perfection. That's a question to be asked. I find it interesting. As I mentioned previously, I wrote my graduate thesis on a comparison of King Lear and Antigone, and it seems like there are a lot of parallels to be made between the protagonists of the two plays. Both of them kind of run up against this patriarchal structure and don't back down, basically, and don't do what they're expected to do, what they're asked to do, that is assumed is just normal. You defer to the men in power, These young women don't, and they both end up in a very bad place as a result of it. And so that's what makes them both, I think, very, very compelling characters. And they weigh their obligations. And I think both of them also come up with the idea that the obligations to these, patriarchal hierarchies aren't necessarily the only things that they have to be to care about. And so they make decisions that perhaps complicate their lives, certainly, but it makes them more interesting. As I said, they may not be uniformly gentle and pure, but they are certainly, you'd have to argue that they're the very, very positive characters in the play. Room for discussion there. We'll see if we have that later. Question number 5. What does the storm in Act 3 symbolize? The knight describes Lear as being out of his mind, comparing the storm inside Lear's head with the storm outside. What is meant by the term unaccommodated man? How does this relate to the larger theme of nature presented in the play? Okay, I think that's a really interesting topic, the idea of unaccommodated man. When we see them at the beginning of the play, the way that the play begins, there's all of this, the trappings of power, and you have, this very rich circumstance, and people being brought into the castle in order to pay their tributes to Lear, and everybody's, very well dressed, and it's, these carpets and furs and things like that. It's usually very lushly portrayed, and you really have the picture of accommodated men that, people in their in all of their kind of grandeur and glory. And when we see out in the storm, Lear basically is brought down to his, minimum base level of humanity. And when he sees Tom o' Bedlam and these, poor beggars out in the elements without clothes, we saw that in Macbeth, last time, where the clothes sort of symbolize some sense of perhaps your appropriate place. Macbeth appropriating clothing and therefore roles that don't necessarily belong to him. Here, the trappings of the role, the king and his robes. And in fact, later on in the play, Lear mentions that when he says that robes hide everything. You can put on a robe and you can pretend to be royal and generous, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And so in that scene in Act 3, when they're out in the elements, it's kind of everybody reduced to their base level of humanity, we're all, whether you're a king or the poorest beggar, you're in the same place. Once again, this is an issue that, in reading this play this week, looking at the COVID-19 crisis going on around us, and the fact that, Prince Charles of England and Boris Johnson and, all these different, the wife of Sophie Trudeau, coming down with this virus and this equal opportunity situation that the doesn't matter who you are, we're all human, and the biology of it puts us in the same place. There's an element of that there, right? That Lear, this great king, is kind of acknowledging something else and something else about himself, right? That's one of the places where the play turns. Lear in the latter stages of the play gains what he loses in privilege and stature, he gains in his humanity. And certainly he's a different person by the end of the play. And I think, part of the pathos and the catharsis of this play is precisely the way the character, you have a great deal of pity for him at the end of the play. It's a very strong emotion, which, as I said, I don't think we've seen it in the other tragedies that we've looked at so far this semester. You don't see anything like that. And all of that comes from precisely this idea of the human outside of the trappings of civilization and all of the structure, the hierarchy that exists, particularly with monarchy. Here he's just a man. He's another man out there in the element with very little clothing on, and at the mercy of these elements that are certainly much larger than him. So we're again closing in on the end of my time, so maybe I will try to put together a 4th module to see if I can finish answering these questions. I hope we can do that. So, bye-bye.